Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to MOTAT. My name is Lorraine Tipene. I am your MC for this evening. Before we get started this evening, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Kingi Tūheitia Potatou Te Wherowhero this week. Moi mai, moi mai, moi mai rā. I would also like to acknowledge the anointment of Queenie Ngā Waihono i te pō today. Ladies and gentlemen, can I please ask you to put your hands together for Halls on guitar, who welcomed us in this evening with some beautiful music. We are so excited to be kicking off our 2024 series of Ngā Kōrero Aviation Conversations right here within our beautiful Aviation Hall. Next month, we will be presenting Attack on Sorpe Dam, a screening of the docudrama film based on a true story, part of the Operation Chastise, the Dam Buster Raid. Very shortly, I will be introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Adam Claasen, for his presentation grid, The Life and Times of First World War fighter ace, Keith Caldwell. Dr. Adam Claasen is a senior lecturer in history at Massey University. He has received a Smithsonian Institution Fellowship and was a Fulbright visiting lecturer at Georgetown University. Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please put your hands together as we welcome Dr. Adam Claasen to the stage.
Thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. I thought I'd do a little bit of my own housekeeping. You're probably wondering what's going on at the front here. We've got a collection of materials, and I want to say thank you so much to the family that have brought them here. We've got a propeller from Keith Grid Caldwell from the First World War. We've also got some of his tabs here, beautifully presented, and of course an SE5A, which was presented to Keith Caldwell by his Squadron members. So that's pretty special. And Sally has just brought up an amazing collection. It's grids, miniatures, his medals. So if you want to get a look at the real thing, it's right here at the front after my talk. So thank you so much for the family for bringing those here. I'd also say that you're going to see some colour photos in here, and the reason I've incorporated them is to give you a real sense of the fact that the First World War wasn't sepia-toned or in black and white or grey-scaled or monochromatic, which is what we often think when we look at old photographs of the First World War. So you're going to see some aircraft that are reproductions from Sir Peter Jackson's collection down in Masterton, and they have been beautifully provided to us tonight from Alan Oodie from down in Blenheim, who does a lot of this kind of work, so I'm very appreciative of that. Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to be here, and it's my great pleasure to talk to you and honour about Keith Grid Caldwell. On this day, 106 years ago, on the 5th of September 1918, 2 months before the end of the First World War, Keith Caldwell was leading a 3-strong offensive patrol high over northwestern France. At 16,000 feet, Caldwell and his wingmen, Sidney Carlin and George Hicks, pointed their Royal Aircraft Factory SE-5s deep into enemy territory. In the distance were dark specks, the feared, dreaded Fokker D-7s. Caldwell alerted Carlin and Hicks of their presence before feeding fuel to the V8 Viper engine of his aircraft and turning the nose into the enemy. As the trio collected speed, the dark smudges on the Fokkers crystallined into black German crosses. Caldwell lined up his twin machine guns on one of them, preparing to fire at close range. And as he was about to do this, he had this massive jolt occur in his aircraft, and it pivoted on its horizontal axis. He turned over to look to his left-hand side, and Carlin's undercarriage had collided with Caldwell's upper left wing, ripping fabric, breaking timber, causing damage to his own machine. He fell away and headed back to his home aerodrome. Hicks stayed close enough to see that Caldwell was in all kinds of hell. The buckled wing had upended the delicate aerodynamics of his SE-5A, and it was doing everything in its power to kill Grid Caldwell. The aircraft fell before entering a semi-flat spin, the altimeter unwinding rapidly in the unchecked descent. Then Hicks saw Caldwell stand up in the cockpit at 5,000 feet, attempting to regain mastery over the machine. Caldwell placed his left foot on the right rudder and leant out as far as he could away from the damaged wings. As Hicks swung his machine away, Caldwell lifted a hand to wave. Hicks was sickened, his squadron commander surely doomed. But of course, Caldwell was not done. A veteran of some 25 months in the British Air Service, he wasn't going to surrender his life so easily. Heading west on a shallow dive, he leant into the full blast of the wind and the backwash of the churning propeller. He calculated his height, his distance, and speed. Reaching his own lines was going to be a very close thing. The German trenches appeared and receded as the SE-5 crossed no man's land, and the roar of the engine alerted British infantry, who looked up as the aeroplane careened barely 10 feet above them. Impact was moments away. And just before the machine hit the earth, Caldwell leapt and tumbled over and over and over, and to the amazement of the onlookers, stood up, brushed off his aviator uniform, and asked for the nearest telephone. That evening, he pulled out his logbook and a pencil, and he wrote in the bottom right-hand corner 3 words: very lucky still. Very lucky still. Who was this Keith Grid Caldwell, CBE, MC, DFC and Bar, and Croix de Guerre? Well, he was the product and a child of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. His father, David, was a stern and exacting, self-made Scottish immigrant, a prosperous businessman in the Dominion. His mother, Mary, a warm and generous woman, the daughter of the Chief Commissioner of the New Zealand Railways Corporation. The family's considerable social status and their wealth was derived from David's partnership in a large company, Mackey, Logan, and Caldwell, a soft goods importation and manufacturing company with shops, warehouses, and storefronts from one end of New Zealand to the other. Their home in Cambridge spanned nearly a half-town block and came populated with servants, a cook, and a chauffeur that would drive David from their home in the Waikato to his business premises in Auckland's CBD and to their second residence in leafy Remuera. If Caldwell's work ethic and playfulness in later life could be attributed to his respective parents, many of his strongly held dispositions that would make him such a successful officer across 2 world wars were accumulated at one of the colony's leading elite educational institutions, Whanganui Collegiate School. The leading schools of the Dominion replicated the aesthetics and manners and teaching practices and philosophies of the English public school system, whose twin goals was the education of the building of character in boys like Caldwell. The supreme aim, in the words of Caldwell's principle, was to train men to be good citizens, able servants of God, King, and country. The classrooms at Whanganui Collegiate School reinforced this message. The 10-point Stags trophies loomed over the wall, lined with photographs and prints of people like Lord Nelson, Earl Kitchener, the Duke of Wellington. Not only were these victors in great conflicts and battles, but for the boys, they were the personification of honor, sacrifice, and bravery. And the links between sacrifice and war were no more evident than in the spiritual heart of the college, the chapel. The eastern window commemorated the old boys that had lost their lives in the Second Anglo-Boer War. Fictional and real heroes of the past and present were the cultural markers, the northern stars that the boys sought to emulate. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Odysseus and his trials, Jesus of Nazareth and his sacrifice for all humankind and his moral teaching, and Robert Falcon Scott in his doomed but magnificent race to the South Pole. Moreover, politicians and schoolmasters of the era wanted young men and women fit and strong and healthy to advance imperial and national causes. The boys gained many of their lifelong values of self-discipline from the twin principal games of the empire, cricket and rugby. The former crafted gentlemen, the latter made men. Caldwell is on the far right-hand side, seated in the slide. And Caldwell was one of the school's leading all-rounders in the first 11 and the first 15. Very good with the boot and with a bat and with ball in hand on a cricket pitch. Implicit martial or military activities also abounded. Caldwell was a colour sergeant in one of the school's battalion's companies. The boys stood on the deck of HMS New Zealand on its tour of the nation, and numerous high-ranking officers would address the boys at various prize-giving gatherings. When Major General Godley spoke at a prize giving, he reminded the boys that their great privileges meant future responsibilities. He said, if God forbid it, the evil day came when war was necessary to defend this little bit of the empire, the boys of the public schools, like these here, the prefects, would be expected to set an example to the soldiers of the country. And of course, Keith is on the far left-hand side, seated right here. Initially, when war came out, Caldwell had graduated, left the college, and he was working as a clerk at the Bank of New Zealand in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, a job he absolutely despised and hated. And when war broke out, he was offered a second lieutenant's commission within the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Caldwell was having none of this. He pleaded his case with the authorities that he might be able to join the most exciting, albeit dangerous, new enterprise in military affairs, the Air Service. And he would go on to become one of the first members of the first intake into the newly established Walsh Brothers Flying School in Mission Bay today. In the summer of 1915, he pitched his tent under the twin Norfolk pines and the Pahutakawa in Mission Bay, overlooking the Waitemata Harbour and beautiful Rangitoto. Perhaps the most picturesque aviation school in the world. Here he learnt to fly on seaplanes, graduating just before Christmas. And then, after completing his training, he travels to the United Kingdom to enter the Royal Flying Corps. He leaves with letters of recommendation from the Walsh brothers, Leo and Vivian. But he also, because of his social standings, gets a letter from Governor Liverpool and a letter of introduction from no one less than the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, William Massey. Ladies and gentlemen, how can I get those kind of connections? Kind of impressive when you think about it, that this young lad turns up with all of this kind of documentation to support his entry into the Royal Flying Corps. Well, Caldwell entered the School of Military Aeronautics, a ground school at Oxford University. It was here that he gained some kind of semblance or understanding about military bearing, gained a knowledge of machinery and weaponry and the dark arts of aviation warfare. before being sent to East Anglia, where he would enter one of the most dangerous periods and phases in the life of a First World War airman, initial flight training. Long before meeting the enemy over the trenches, prospective pilots like Caldwell had to face home training fields where students seemed hell-bent on killing themselves, aided and abetted by wayward machines and complicit instructors. About a fifth of all airmen who would die in the British Air Service in the First World War, in fact, died under training on the airfields in England, long before they were confronted with the enemy over the Western Front. Caldwell, though, went through this extremely well. His logbook only charts a couple of things that went wrong in his training, and they were to do with long-distance journeys and finding himself lost and having to land, find out his location, and replot his course back to the home airbase. He was successful in all of this and was posted to 8th Squadron in July of 1916 during the brutal Battle of the Somme. The unit was equipped with the aircraft you can see behind me, the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C. This was a plodding, slow machine, but it was incredibly stable. It had a top speed of something like 70 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 10,000 feet. A few days after arriving at the squadron, Caldwell was inserted into a bombing mission with only 30 hours in his logbook. It was an attack on positions south of Arras, a nerve-wracking sortie threatened by anti-aircraft fire and with the ever-present danger of the much-feared Fokker Eindecker, the first point-and-shoot single-seat fighter of the war. Caldwell was also engaged in reconnaissance operations, bombing operations, but the most common thing that he found himself doing in 8th Squadron was ranging in big British guns on enemy trenches, fortifications, and German artillery. Caldwell found all of this boring, tedious, even though it was incredibly dangerous. So he would take his BE-2C out, and sometimes he would loop it. There's at least 3 occasions I know of in looking at this, and that's not something I would advise, ladies and gentlemen. Trying to loop an aircraft like a BE-2C is not something that's recommended by the manufacturer. On occasions, he was known to attack observation balloons, also extremely dangerous in a slow machine like this. He gathered his first victory in aerial combat on the 18th of September. It was a joyride flight with one of his favorite observers, a guy called Patrick Walshman. 1.5 hours into the early evening flight, their mission was interrupted by the sound of a machine gun firing like the blazes, said Caldwell afterwards. They had been jumped by 2 very dangerous German 2-seater fighters, the Roland C-2s, nicknamed the Whales. And I think you can see why due to their shape here, but don't let that fool you. They were incredibly deadly. No one less than Albert Ball considered these to be the most fearsome aircraft in the German infantry in 1916. After getting only 10 bullets off from their Lewis machine gun, it jammed, and Caldwell put the BE-2C into a vertical turn in the descending gloom. By the time the jam had been cleared, the 2 machines were now only 30 yards apart from each other, the set jaw lines of the German airmen visible beneath their goggles. Welshman let off 40 bullets. The trace of fire were a luminous trail arching towards the enemy. The rounds were banging into the German aircraft, and Welshman's drum was nearly spent when he let out a shout of joy. The whale had been harpooned. It entered a vertical dive, thick ribbons of smoke marking its death plunge down to the village below. Caldwell later recorded that he and Welshman cheered like maniacs and were filled with euphoria when they arrived back at the airbase and the squadron CO was patting them on the back, the very first victory the squadron had ever had. Unsurprising, ladies and gentlemen, they were BE-2Cs. You're really not supposed to be involved in these kinds of activities. For Caldwell, though, he found that he was unable to replicate this success, and that was because this type of aircraft was rapidly slipping into obsolescence. By the end of the year, the Germans were gaining the ascendancy over the Western Front with the arrival of a new set of aircraft, the Albatros D series, and a new breed of pilot, Richthofen, Udet, Jacobs, and of course the Wunderkid, Werner Voss. Caldwell applied for a transfer to a fighter unit. And in November of 1939, he arrived at 60 Squadron, a battle-scarred survivor of the Somme offensive. It was one of the first exclusively single-seat fighter squadrons in the Royal Flying Corps. Caldwell would be flying a French-designed Newport 17. It had a powerful rotary engine that gave it a top speed of 110 miles per hour and a climb rate that could deliver this compact beauty to 10,000 feet in only 12 minutes. If the BE-2C was kind of like a sedate, refined gentleman, the Newport 17 was a feisty Parisian street brawler looking for a stoush. It was with 60 Squadron that Caldwell acquired his nickname of Grid. He'd been out on a mission and returned early because the engine was misfiring and misbehaving. When they inquired as to why he returned prematurely, he took an Edwardian slang word for a push bike, and he said, "My grid was lousy." And thereafter, when he wanted to know how his aeroplane was going, he would ask the mechanics, "How's my grid?" And then when he became a flight commander and when he became a squadron commander and he wanted the aircraft to be brought out for operations, he would say, "Ladies, bring out the grids." Caldwell's first encounter with the fearsome flying circus came at the end of January, the middle of a very intense winter on the Western Front. He was part of a 3-strong patrol at a bone-rattling cold 14,000 feet. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. 3 layers of clothing, whale oil plastered on your face to stave off, frost and everything else. And it was in this condition that they spotted 8 colorful albatross led by a blood-red machine. In this 8 versus 3 mismatch, Caldwell's aircraft was hit. Explosive bullets punctured the fuel tank and petrol poured over his knees and feet under attack from the blood-red machine. This was, of course, an airman's greatest fear. Let's think about this. An aircraft made of timber and doped fag brick. It was almost designed to catch on fire. And of course, members of the British Air Service had no parachutes. We're at 14,000 feet. If the aircraft catches fire, you only have 3 options: to die painfully and be incinerated in this flaming torch, or to jump from the aircraft to your death, or to take out your service revolver and shoot yourself. Fortunately for Caldwell, his aircraft did not catch on fire. He fled the scene, arriving at his home aerodrome, clambering out of the heavily damaged Newport 17, reeking of fuel. Probably Caldwell's most famous dogfight came a few months later. After receiving his military cross, he was elevated to a flight commander. And with a wingman at 7,000 feet, they spotted an enemy 2-seater and attacked. It was an ambush. Caldwell's wingman was immediately killed and 3 enemy machines latched onto Caldwell. He was able to evade 2 of them, but one could not be shaken. It was Werner Voss, perhaps the greatest of the German pilots of the First World War, sitting on 40 victories at this point in his career. Caldwell sat on 2. He was flying a much more powerful aircraft, an Albatros D3, more heavily armed than Caldwell. and Werner Voss's 8mm machine gun struck Caldwell's fuel tank, and his machine faltered. The engine started to misfire. Heart thumping, Caldwell tried every trick that he knew in a dogfight that fell in staggered feet from 7,000 feet down to 1,000 feet. And then luck arrived on the scene. His engine miraculously roared into life, fed with fuel. And in a desperate climbing turn, he found the German banking in front of him, and he fired at the Albatross. Werner Voss turned away at only 700 feet above the ground and fled east. Caldwell returned with his machine all chewed up to the squadron's aerodrome. He was shaken with bullet holes in his clothing. That night he took out his log book again, and he wrote inside it, Voss Areno, hot stuff. It was during his time with 60 Squadron that he solidified his claims, not that he had them himself, but his reputation for absolute bravery. 2 months after this event, Caldwell and the great Billy Bishop, who you can see here on the left-hand side, the kind of Canadian hero of the air war, a national celebrity. He and Caldwell were in an existential fight with 7 Albatrosses of Juster 12, including the mercurial Adolf von Tutschek. Caldwell got behind one of these aircraft, but his 2 machine guns failed. Amazingly, though, he stayed in the fight, completely defenseless and at the mercy of these ruthless German pilots. He stayed in there attempting to help Billy Bishop escape. He moved in, feigning that the guns were working, and then he moved out. Then he moved in, and then he came out. Billy Bishop wrote about this experience in his memoirs. And it wasn't just that Caldwell was amazing with his flying skills and his maneuverability, but Billy Bishop said this. He said, one of the bravest deeds I have ever heard of. And of course, Caldwell did this on a number of occasions. And this earned him his other nickname, which was Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave. Marshal Ney was a famous commander in Napoleon's army and was engaged in some of the most terrific rearguard actions in the retreat from the abortive mission in Russia and in Moscow. And that name was applied to Caldwell, Marshal Ney, bravest of the brave. Well, for all of this, Caldwell went from being in command of himself in 8 Squadron, becoming a flight commander in 60 Squadron. But in 1918, he was given command of his own unit. This was to be 74 Squadron at the ripe age of 22. And I say, ladies and gentlemen, does he not look magnificent on the left here? He is with one of his good friends. It is our man, Sidney Carland, the gentleman who would later plow into his aircraft in the story I started this presentation with. But they look like the cat's pajamas here, don't they? He'd been given command of his newly formed unit just in time to face the German spring offensive. How big was a squadron? Most people, when you think about what a squadron was, you're probably going to think just about the airmen who flew it. But in actual fact, it was over 200 individuals that included mechanics, riggers, carpenters. You had batmen, you have orderlies, you have an intelligence officer, a recording officer. It is a vast array of people to be given command of at the very young age of 22. And on the 21st of March 1918, preceded by 1.1 million shells fired over a 5-hour period, and bolstered by over 1 million men freed from the Eastern Front, massed grey uniformed German stormtroopers arose in the early morning fog, and within 48 hours, the British Fifth Army was in full retreat. Caldwell's 74 Squadron arrived on the Western Front with the Germans a mere 24 kilometres from their goal, the channel ports of Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk. on the squadron's first day of operations, and against the general prohibition against commanding officers flying in such operations, Caldwell inserted himself into the morning's last offensive patrol. And of course, this is a wonderful photograph of 74 Squadron, Caldwell in his SE-5A on the far right-hand side. At 17,000 feet, he spotted a lone Albatross D5 fighter. He pushed the stick forward, dropping the nose. He swooped on the Albatross, and its red and yellow checked wings filling his vision, he fired. The tracer bullets were like bright meteors stabbing holes in the fuselage. It was quick and decisive. The German machine stumbled and fell, the dark plowed earth enveloping the bright and twisted bird. Caldwell's victory was one of 5 that day for a squadron, a record for the first day of operations in the British Air Service. It was soon nicknamed the Tigers for their ferocity in aerial combat. 74 Squadron under Grid's leadership and a trio of flight commanders, including the famous Mick Mannock on the far left-hand side here, was the first or the quickest to 50, 100, 150, and then over some 200 days, 225 victories. And all of this for a remarkably low casualty rate of 10 killed in action, 4 in accidents, and 8 POWs. It made it one of the most successful squadrons of 1918. With so many distinguished flying crosses, it became also known as the DFC Squadron. And no less a person than the King of England is inspecting them here in 1918. Caldwell, by the end of the war, was New Zealand's highest scoring pilot with 26 victories in aerial combat, many of his latter victories against the much feared Fokker D7. His longevity as a pilot from 1916 to 1918 meant he had witnessed firsthand the development of aerial fighting tactics, the rapid advance in aircraft from the slow Walsh brothers flying planes to the seaplanes to the most powerful machines of his era. Well, of course, on the 11th day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war came to an end and Caldwell returned to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where he took up farming in Glen Murray in the Waikato, breaking in a hill country dry stock farm with his wife Dorothy and their 4 children. Beautiful photograph of his marriage to the sweet Dorothy. And of course, some of the children and family members here. Of course, he didn't give up some of his other interests, including rugby. He spent some time up in what we would call Northland today. He played an international match with North Auckland against an Australian team, and sometimes he would head all the way back down to his alma mater, Wanganui Collegiate School, and he would play with the old boys, and this is one of these photos after the match against the current first 15. And as you can see, they are incredibly relaxed. One of my favorite photos from in the book. In addition to this, Caldwell retained his aviation connections and was appointed a commander of the nation's territorial air force. His principal activities in all of this centered on the annual Wigram refresher courses designed to preserve the skills that men had acquired during the Great War. He was also instrumental in establishing the Auckland Aero Club and was a feature pilot at air shows, reenacting the battles of the First World War, often in a yellow de Havilland Moth. In 1937, so busy on his farm, he handed in his uniform only for the Second World War to arrive. He re-entered the Royal New Zealand Air Force. His principal positions in New Zealand, domestic postings, were stations Woodburn and Wigram, where men were trained as pilots and aircrew for Europe for bomber commands, Short Stirlings, Halifaxes, and the Avro Lancaster. After Pearl Harbor, for deployment with the RNZAF in Catalina flying boats, Lockheed Hudsons and Venturas. This meant that Caldwell was responsible for training more personnel domestically than anybody else in the country. In fact, some 2,000 pilots were trained under Caldwell's leadership, enough to equip an entire nation's air force. At its height, Wigram Station possessed 2,500 personnel, including 300 in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. It was a demanding posting, finding accommodation for the women. Women had not appeared in such numbers in uniform ever in New Zealand's history, and so he had to find accommodation and deal with a whole range of issues. He also had to put down a mutiny at Wigram, which nobody's ever written about, never made it into the papers, but you will find it in the book that you're going to buy later tonight. An incredible event. He also had an overmanning crisis, something the Royal New Zealand Air Force would love to have as a problem today. And he dealt with that. So he became also not just a great administrator, a great manager, but quite a political animal, because the last issue meant a parliamentary committee arriving at Wigram and went all the way to the Prime Minister Peter Fraser's office. Well, for his troubles in all of this and his abilities, Caldwell in late 1944 was dispatched to India to quell a growing chorus of discontent among some 600 New Zealanders who had been forgotten in the RAF. In these demanding climactic and diseased conditions, morale was extremely low. The New Zealand airmen and aircrew felt that they had been abandoned by their superiors in Wellington and Whitehall, and Caldwell brought his particular skill set, pastoral care to them, and was able to create a completely different environment. And then in May of 1945, at the end of the Second World War, as an Air Commodore, he took up his last posting with the Royal New Zealand Air Force headquarters in London. And it was there that he would organise and manage one of the largest repatriations of New Zealanders in uniform in our history. Some 4,000 New Zealanders who had served with the RAF in bomber, fighter, coastal and transport command. Some 4,000 individuals. It was a demanding job that required a good deal, and he loved this, hobnobbing and meeting people of elevated status and of incredible interest. For example, Judge Robert Jackson, who has served on the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, Lord Balfour, Ernest Bevan, Bernard Freyberg, Len Isett, Viscount Trenchard, Charles Portal, Arthur Harris, and some of the pilots of the Second World War, Adolf Sailor Milan and New Zealand's own Al Deere. He was also, because of his position, able to take flying visits to cities that had been destroyed by the men he had trained at Wigram, turning up in Berlin, dropping in on the remnants of Hitler's chancellery, the Reichstag, and Goering's Luftwaffe's headquarters. Of course, he had to return to New Zealand and was only too happy to be embraced by Dorothy upon his arrival. With his return to New Zealand, Caldwell relocated to a farm in Papatoetoe, and in the tradition of the time, set about marrying off his two daughters and dividing the farm between his two sons. In the 1960s, along with other airmen, he formalised the First World War Airmen's Reunion in New Zealand, into the New Zealand 1914-1918 Airmen's Association, which at its peak attracted some 200 attendees, including people like Keith Park, reconnaissance specialist John Seabrook, Royal Naval Air Service Airman Harold Beamish, Sopwith Dolphin pilot Ronald Bannerman. Brandishing brandies and cigarettes, the increasingly silver-haired airmen discussed the attributes of their favourite grids and buses, relayed old battles and told tall stories that were reported in newspapers under suitably evocative, if sometimes corny, headings. Warbirds fly back the years, and canvas kites and Huns in the Sun. Grid, over the last 2 decades of his life, became increasingly sought after as a commentator and source of expertise on First World War aviation. He answered a large number of letters. He critiqued texts that other authors sent to him and engaged in a long and enjoyable correspondence with his aged comrades from the First World War, but shied away from anything that led to promoting himself. He was excessively modest. His greatest joy in his latter years were to be found with his family and the large brood of 17 grandchildren. One of his grandsons, Christopher Mackey, was aviation mad and obtained his flying license as a student at Wanganui Collegiate School. He took his grandfather, the legendary 5-times ace, up in a small 4-seater Cessna from the Rex Manukau Flying School at Ardmore. These flights roamed over Auckland and often included the Glen Murray Farms, Dorothy working in their new residence in Glendowie, and the waters of Mission Bay, where Caldwell began his flying career in 1915. During their flights, Caldwell, who had survived half a dozen crashes in the First World War, imparted hard-earned knowledge on dealing with engine failures, landing on the water, and even how to negotiate landing in a tree. Mostly, though, it was simply the joy of being airborne with his grandson, who recalled that having, quote, my grandfather Keith sitting in the right-hand seat flying the Cessna aircraft was the highlight of my flying hours. On the 28th of February 1918, aged 85, and surrounded by his family, the bravest of the brave, Keith Grid Caldwell, CBE, MC, DFC and Bar, and Croix de Guerre died. A great New Zealander. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that action-packed story. That was really thrilling, wasn't it? We would now like to open the floor to anyone who has any questions. So I think we're going to start with Simon Wetherill. However, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Claasen. That was fascinating. So I'm actually the head of the Walsh Memorial Library here at MOTAT, and I'm very, very curious to get your take on going back to 1915 and him taking learning to fly at the Walsh flying school. I'm curious to know how much of his success you would attribute to those 2.5 months he spent learning there before actually going over and entering the RFC training program?
You know, I think it was a great advantage to Caldwell to be trained here in Auckland. Those aircraft were slow, maybe 60 to 70 miles per hour. They, he would fly up to maybe, if you were lucky, 3,000, 4,000 feet. They had difficulty, in fact, taking off because they were so heavy and kind of underpowered. That original seaplane was a copy of a Curtiss-designed aircraft, but made by the Walsh brothers here. And to kind of give an indication of how underpowered they were, when the harbour was like a mill glass, when it was clear and they were trying to take off, they couldn't break surface tension with the hull of the aircraft. So they would have to get a boat out in front to zigzag in front to enable them to take off. But I think that actually helped Caldwell. It was incredibly safe, and unlike the training fields of England, not a single New Zealander died in training, at least the pilots died in training here in New Zealand, in Auckland. And so I think it was a huge advantage. So when he turns up in East Anglia, he's already got the rudiments of, flying an airplane down. And I think that's why he does, so well. So that was, a kind of another lucky moment for him, really. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
So regarding, I recall that you were saying at one point that he was flying at 14,000 feet in one of the aircraft. Would they have had oxygen supply? Because I thought they were open cockpit.
You know, you would think so, but that's not the case. It's an open cockpit. You're completely exposed. There is no oxygen. And of course, hypoxia is a real problem if you're flying at extended altitude. You know, once you're heading up over that 14,000 feet, up to 17,000 feet, pilots are getting headaches. Their judgment's impaired, and of course it's incredibly cold. So if you're at sea level, the temperature is 15 degrees Celsius. By the time you get to like 10,000 feet, is it 10,000 or 50, you're already at -5. And so the higher you go, the colder it is. And of course, on that day in January, which was a particularly cold winter on the Western Front, you have got all kinds of layers on, and the boots you're wearing, you know, they're coming up to here, wool-lined, and you've got multiple layers on. So, it's not like flying in a modern aircraft. You are really exposed. And to think you haven't got a parachute. Yeah, it's a challenging environment, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, for the pilots at the time, you know, we look back at them and we kind of think of them as rickety biplanes. That's not the case. You know, the early aircraft were kind of weak, underpowered. If you think about the Longhorns and Shorthorns, the Henry Farmans and all that sort of stuff. But by the time you're getting to 1916 and then 17, the aircraft are incredibly robust and powerful for their period, without a doubt. They were the modern machines that people wanted to fly. But it is a different flying game than the one, you know, that would appear in the Second World War.
Thank you. I just had a question around like your ability to, you know, get such a detailed account of some of these battles. You know, if Grid just came back and wrote, you know, Very Lucky Still, you know, how the process of like corroborating some of these accounts and, you know, like did it involve, you know, going through some of the German accounts potentially of some of these battles and that kind of thing. And, you know, I was just interested in how that picture is built.
So if he's involved in combat, he's also recording everything in his logbooks, usually. But I've got to say about Grid that he wasn't always the best bookkeeper. And there is an occasion where there's a kind of a big gap in his logbook, and I'm thinking, well, he's obviously on leave. And then I discovered the officer's record book at the National Archives in Kew, London, for the squadron, and it detailed dozens and dozens of sorties that he flew that were missing from the logbook. So the key thing is to get in as many sources as possible to corroborate and fill in the gaps. And the other thing is that they also wrote combat reports, and we have a good deal of those are available. So by checking the logbook with a combat report, with an officer's record book, if it was available, which is basically a list of all the sorties in a book, you know, about the size of this, but filled with every officer in the squadron, you can kind of corroborate what happened. Other sources come into play where he would write about it afterwards. So one of the real key things for the story, so Caldwell himself was asked to write his own memoirs in the 1970s. And he really didn't have the energy or the capacity to do it at that stage. And so some people said, well, you know, use the most modern technology. Why don't you record your voice and your stories to cassette tapes, send them to us overseas, we'll transcribe them, and, you know, we'll create the book. He didn't want anything to do with that. And then, of course, after he passed away in 1980, he was asked, you know, people wanted to write this book because he'd been in the air service for so long. He knew Albert Ball. I didn't get to say this, but in 8th Squadron, his tent was right next to the first celebrity ace in the Royal Flying Corps, Albert Ball, the cherub-faced violinist and gardener, a celebrity. And of course, it was Albert Ball's stories about being a fighter pilot, in part that you know, inspired Grid. And so all of this stuff, this additional material, had to be found somewhere else. And a lot of that I got from the family. So, and I was very fortunate that when I approached Nicola Leggett at Massey University Press, and I said to her, look, I'm thinking about, from my previous book, there's one person who's head and shoulders above everybody else, but I'm not sure if there's enough material to make a fulsome biography. She said to me, well, I happen to know Sally Gordon, who was one of Keith's grandchildren. And Sally opened up all of these doors, aside from having a great New World shopping bag full of letters and photographs and all sorts of things which she made available to me. And of course, I was able to interview Sally's mother, Mary, who was at that stage this kind of sole surviving child of Keith and Dorothy's, and she was amazing, you know, the kind of interview material, and from other members of the family and the grandchildren. And then, of course, Andrew Caldwell's here, and I went out to his farm at Glen Murray, and, you know, he apologized and said some stuff had got destroyed in a flood, and then he comes out with this massive suitcase, and then a box, and another box, and that was full of letters and documents and all sorts of things. And then Deb Stivell contacts me, and she's got materials as well, including the largest extant collection of letters from an airman in the First World War. It was 27 letters written by Keith Grid Caldwell to his mother, who was living in London. An incredible source that was able to insert his voice into the narrative. I was going to say, I don't know how much time we've got. We can take some more questions, but I wanted to show you a short piece of film just so I could, as a segue to saying something about Keith Caldwell's sense of humour. I hope you don't mind, folks. It's like extending my talk. It's cheating, really, isn't it? But I want to show you a piece of footage, and this is incredible. It is rare. It comes from 1917 when a film crew visited 60 Squadron on the Western Front. The central figure in this short 10-second footage is Billy Bishop, but off his shoulder, tall, unruly mop of black hair, is Keith Caldwell. There's no music, there's no commentary. It's from 1917. Let's just have a quick look at this. Wonderful, isn't it? You know, he had a great sense of humour. On one occasion, when they weren't doing any flying and operations were not possible, he got the mechanics to get the grids out, and they loaded 200 oranges in their aircraft to attack another RAF squadron, number 1 squadron, which is very old, had a storied history, prestigious, 74 squadron with the new kids on the block, the upstarts, and he decides that they're going to attack them in the airfield nearby. The first thing the members of 1 squadron hear is the sound of thumping on the tin roofs of their Nissan huts. They go outside to see the sky full of these orange projectiles heading towards them. Hit one guy, stunned him momentarily, a successful attack. Later that day, one squadron reciprocated in what became known as the Fruit Wars, with overripe bananas. They retired that evening to a famous restaurant in St. Omar. Peace settled, an agreed settlement, no further escalation of the conflict. On another occasion, Caldwell came back from leave, and he had brought back false beards, ginger beards, black beards, grey beards, blonde beards, and he got the men to wear them on an operation to befuddle the Germans. Imagine this, ladies and gentlemen. They're flying at 10,000 feet in an SE-5A, and the Germans see these beards fluttering in behind these airmen. So he had a great sense of humour. Any other questions?
You mentioned flying B-2s, Newport 17s. Was that his entire range of combat aircraft in the First World War?
Well, just to give you an example of how good he was as a pilot, when the Sopwith Camel arrived for evaluative testing on the Western Front for the first time, The Royal Flying Corps chose only 2 individuals from the hundreds that were available, and one of them was Keith Caldwell. And if you know anything about the Sopwith Camel, it is not for the uninitiated. People often said that it was either going to give you a Victoria Cross or a Red Cross. It's either you're going to become famous flying it, or it's going to kill you. And of course, they asked Caldwell to fly this aircraft. He not only flew British machines, but he got to fly German aircraft as well, including the Fokker D7, which I showed you towards the end there, the kind of mass-produced, most lethal aircraft in the German inventory. In fact, the only aircraft mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles explicitly banned from Germany holding. He got to fly one of those after the end of the war, and he found it incredibly powerful and better than his own aircraft, the SE-5A, according to his judgment. So yeah, he flew a lot of different aircraft, and I haven't covered, but I have quite a bit of this in the book, that between 60 Squadron and 74 Squadron, there was about a 3-month period in which he went back to the UK and flew a whole lot of new aircraft in a kind of a revamped training scheme. And so he would be flying a Bristol fighter, and just a whole range of machines across there. And it's all, his logbook kind of catalogues the types of aircraft that he flew, but yes, certainly more than those 3.
Just with, you said he transferred to a fighter squadron. How did the progression between being just flying and becoming fighter pilots and bomber pilots and things how did that progress in the war?
Well, I didn't say this, but one of the reasons he got to be a fighter pilot was that he said later that Albert Ball actually put in a good word for him. And that greased the wheels for his transfer to 60 Squadron, which was Albert Ball's, I think, his old squadron. Yeah, if you were in a fighter squadron and found unsuitable for it, because you had to have quick reactions, a good endurance, and you did have to have a good degree of internal fortitude, you would be transferred to a bomber squadron, or you'd be transferred to a reconnaissance squadron. So it was really the cream of the crop that ended up in the fighter squadrons. And in a lot of cases, early on, it was sink or swim. You know, I mean, here he was, he'd been with a squadron for a handful of days, and he's immediately inserted into a bombing operation. Yeah, and if you think about the training that he underwent, even the trainers hadn't been trained in how to train. I mean, on those home fields in England in 1915 and 1916, a lot of those individuals who were the instructors were men who were suffering from PTSD and had been sent back on home establishment duties to train these young men. And on often occasions, they were more fearful of their young trainees than they were of the Germans, because they thought, you know, if I hand the controls over to this trainee, they're going to kill me. And so a lot of pilots, when they went over to the Western Front, had not, you know, when they went up solo in Britain, they had not been given the controls, even in a dual control aircraft. And, you know, once you were inserted, and that changed a lot, and Caldwell saw that, so he was incredibly pastoral and careful of his men when he became a flight commander, because he had seen what it was like in 1916, and certainly when he was commanding 74 Squadron. So when a new person arrived, they would undertake familiarization flights, and when they undertook their first sortie, he would often pair them up with an extremely experienced member of the squadron to avoid the kind of disasters where a person would arrive with the squadron and within 24 hours there was an empty chair in the mess. So yeah, things really changed over time, and he was very concerned about that. And when he got 74 Squadron and they were about to go out on their first operations, he said, there are 2 things I really require of you men. He said, firstly, you're going to be punctual. When it's time to undertake an operation, you will be there. And the other is, never abandon a fellow airman regardless of the odds you are facing. Otherwise, you will have my boot up your backside, in Kiwi vernacular. And he said, gentlemen, I need not remind you, I have big feet. Yeah, so he was very protective of his men in all kinds of crazy ways. I think of a couple of teetotalers in the squadron who didn't want to drink alcohol at the social gatherings, and so they would make up these drinks that kind of looked like they were alcoholic. And so other members of the squadron started to rib them and give them a hard time. Grid just put a lid on it immediately, said, what does this matter? And of course, one of the men that was getting a hard time was Ira Taffy Jones, who would go on to be an extremely competent pilot during 1918. So he was very much about making the squadron a family, and that's what he said to them: I want us to operate as a family. And it was kind of very casual with the squadron. There wasn't, and other squadrons criticized 74 Squadron, but the members of the squadron were incredibly loyal to Caldwell, and of course the results spoke for themselves. I mean, the other thing I'd say, if I could just change the subject briefly, is the book also looks a lot at Billy Bishop. I was able to uncover a lot about Keith's thoughts about Billy Bishop being incredibly brave, a great person to have at a party, but not always completely reliable. And all those stories about Billy Bishop, they come out in some of the chapters where he's conversing with other airmen, recalling the events of 60 Squadron and his flight for which he received a Victoria Cross.
Hi. So probably his most famous combat would have been with Werner Voss. Do you know if there's any record on the German side of that action, or other historians? Because lots of books written about Voss.
There are a lot of books written about Voss. Voss is an incredibly interesting character. A little bit of an Easter egg with this book, ladies and gentlemen, because I know you're going to be picking it up as you leave. But the cover of it actually represents and tells the story of that combat. On the front is the silver of the Newport 17 with the roundels of the Royal Flying Corps. On the back, I should say, getting it right, Adam. On the back here we have Werner Voss's purple with the Maltese cross. So some people do suggest that it might have been somebody else, but at the time Caldwell was convinced it was Werner Voss, and the reasons for this was, one, the skill of Werner Voss, and also it was reported from people on the ground that was Werner Voss, who phoned into the squadron and said it was. And in addition to this, Caldwell actually got to see the demise of Werner Voss a few months later when he got trapped by 56 Squadron in a massive dogfight. And this is how good Werner Voss was. He was surrounded by no less than 8 British aces and still led them a merry dance before his demise. So Caldwell got to experience in being attacked. There was the report on the ground, and then he got to see the replication of those flying skills in this dogfight. But no, not from the German side. I don't have any materials on that. Yeah.
Well, if we have no further questions, I think that might wrap up tonight's conversation. So thank you so much for being here this evening. Dr. Adam Claasen will be available to sign copies of Grid, which can be purchased at our shop in the front. Thank you again, and mā te wā.